My name is Leena, and I used to think love meant loyalty. I'm 31 now, but when I close my eyes, I can still hear my father's voice from when I was 23. The way he said, "Be realistic," like it was a prayer and a curse all at once. I grew up in a small town just outside Lahore, where dreams were supposed to fit neatly into family expectations. My parents, both schoolteachers, valued respectability over passion. My father taught mathematics, my mother Urdu literature, and they had mapped out my life before I could spell my own name: study hard, become a teacher, marry a good man, and live quietly. But I wanted more. Ever since I was little, I loved houses, the shapes, the stories they held. I used to draw floor plans on the backs of my notebooks, sketching sunlight through imagined windows. I wanted to be an architect. Not just someone who built walls, but someone who designed space for people to breathe. When I told my parents that's what I wanted, they laughed. Not cruelly, at least not at first, but in that dismissive, half-kind way people do when they think they know better. My mother said, "Leena, that's for rich people. Girls like us can't afford to dream like that." That sentence lodged in my chest like a splinter. I still remember sitting in the cramped living room, sunlight pouring through thin curtains, the smell of lentils on the stove. My father looked up from his newspaper and said, "Your mother's right. We barely have enough for your brother's engineering degree. Architecture? It's a waste. Be practical." And just like that, my dream was declared too expensive to exist. I tried to be obedient. For a while. I enrolled in a teaching diploma program because that's what they wanted, but every class felt like a betrayal, not to them, but to myself. I'd sit there pretending to take notes, while my hand itched to draw lines, arches, and angles. I couldn't breathe under the weight of their good intentions. When I finally told them I wanted to drop out and apply for a scholarship to study architecture in Karachi, my father didn't yell, which somehow hurt even more. He just said calmly, "Leena, if you walk out that door for this nonsense, don't expect our support."
I walked out anyway.
For the next few years, life was survival. I worked part-time at a cafe, slept in a shared hostel room that smelled like damp books, and spent nights sketching until my hands cramped. There were nights I cried quietly so my roommates wouldn't hear. Not because I regretted my choice, but because it hurt knowing that the people I loved most had decided I was foolish for believing in myself. Then came the day that changed everything, my first internship at an architecture firm. It wasn't glamorous. I made coffee more than I made blueprints. But I was in. I was learning. And slowly, the city started to feel like something I could belong to. Years passed. I graduated, got a job, and climbed my way up from assistant to junior designer. By 28, I was leading small projects. Every building I touched felt like proof that I wasn't the failure my parents imagined.
But they didn't see it that way.
Whenever I called home, my mother's voice carried that same tone, polite, distant, as if I were a relative calling from abroad. "Your father says it's good you're working," she'd say, "but when are you going to think about marriage?" Marriage. That was always the measure of success in our family. My younger brother, Saad, had gotten married at 26. My parents threw a grand reception, and I wasn't even invited. My father said he didn't want people asking questions about why his daughter was unmarried and living alone in a big city. That night, I cried harder than I had in years. Not because I wasn't invited, but because I realized I'd stopped being their daughter the moment I stopped obeying. Still, I kept going. I told myself one day I'd make them proud. One day, they'd see I wasn't a mistake. When I turned 30, I bought my first piece of land, a small plot on the outskirts of Lahore. The price terrified me, but when I signed those papers, something inside me healed. I was finally building what I dreamed of all along, my own home. But that's when life decided to twist the knife. It started with a phone call. My mother's voice trembled when she said, "Your father isn't well. He's been coughing blood." Everything else stopped. Work, sleep, time. I took a leave of absence and went home. My father had tuberculosis, and the stress of treatment nearly broke them, financially and emotionally. I didn't think twice. I sold my car, drained my savings, and paid for his treatment. I didn't care about the money. It was my father. Despite everything, he was still my hero in some corner of my heart. When he recovered months later, he didn't thank me. Instead, he said, "You did what any daughter should do." That sentence stung more than any insult. But I let it go. Because love makes you forgive things logic never would. When I told them I was planning to build a small house on the plot I'd bought, my mother smiled faintly and said, "You should wait, Beta. It's not the time. You'll need that money later, for your own marriage." I ignored her. I poured everything I had into that house. The design was simple but full of light, wide windows, open spaces, and a terrace where I could see the sunrise. I even designed a small garden for my mother. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I showed them what I'd built, they'd finally see me. And they did. Just not in the way I imagined. When the house was finished, I invited them to see it. They arrived together, my mother in her faded maroon shawl, my father leaning heavily on his cane. I'll never forget the look in their eyes when they stepped inside, wonder mixed with something else. Something sharp. "Who helped you with this?" my father asked, his tone not curious, but skeptical. "No one," I said. "I designed it myself." He looked around, then smiled, but not the kind of smile that warms you. "It's impressive," he said slowly. "Maybe too impressive." I laughed awkwardly. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "A single woman can't afford something like this unless someone's helping her." The words hit like a slap. My mother didn't say anything, but the way she looked away told me she believed it too. I'd spent years trying to make them proud, and instead, they thought I'd sold myself to some man. That night, after they left, I sat in the empty living room, the same room I'd dreamed of since I was a girl, and felt nothing but hollow. Weeks later, my father called again. His tone was warm, almost too warm. He said they'd had some financial trouble. Saad had taken a loan for a failed business, and they might lose their house. "You have a new place now," he said. "Could you help us? Just until things get better?" Of course, I said yes. I told them they could move in with me until they got back on their feet. That was my mistake. At first, it was supposed to be temporary, but months turned into years. My father started acting like the house was his, making decisions, rearranging things, telling relatives it was his daughter's gift to him. My mother began calling it our family home. One evening, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. My father said, "If we can get the deed transferred, this place will stay in the family. She'll thank us later." I remember standing in the hallway, frozen, listening to my own parents plotting to take my house. It wasn't anger that came first, it was disbelief. Then grief. Because I realized the people I'd spent my life trying to win over would never see me as anything but a foolish girl with too big dreams. That was the night I decided I wouldn't beg for their love anymore. The night I overheard my parents talking about transferring the deed, something in me cracked. Not in a loud, cinematic way. There was no yelling, no slammed doors, no storm of rage. It was quieter than that, like the soft sound of glass breaking underwater. I remember sitting on my bed, staring at the blueprints rolled up in the corner. They'd been my pride once. Every line, every curve drawn with hope. Now they looked like evidence of my stupidity. I had designed this house to be a home, and instead, it had become a weapon in someone else's hands. For a few days, I pretended I hadn't heard anything. I watched them go about their routine. My father watering the plants in the garden I built for my mother folding laundry like the world was perfectly ordinary. But something had changed in how they looked at me. There was a strange politeness in their voices now, like I was a guest they were tired of hosting. One evening, while I was cooking dinner, my mother casually said, "Your father met with a lawyer today. He says it might be good to have all the property documents properly updated, just to avoid confusion later." I froze, the spoon still in my hand. "Updated how?" She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "You know, family property can be complicated. It would make sense to have his name included, so if anything happens to you, it stays in the family." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "You mean if anything happens to me, the house goes to you?" She flinched just a little. Then she said almost softly, "Leena, you have no husband, no children. We're your family. We deserve to feel secure too. That word, deserve, sank into my stomach like a stone. Later that night, I went into my father's study. He never locked it, he didn't think he needed to. On his desk, half covered by newspapers, was a file from the lawyer. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were copies of the property papers, my house, with fresh notations in the margin. In one of them, my father's name had been penciled in beside mine, as if waiting to be typed officially. I stood there for a long time, staring at that single, fraudulent addition. It's strange how betrayal doesn't always come with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in pencil marks and polite smiles. I didn't confront them that night. Instead, I started documenting everything. Copies of the deed, bank transfers, messages, call logs. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do, but some part of me knew love wasn't going to protect me anymore. Days passed. My father started asking for small things, changes to the account names, authorization for maintenance bills, permission to handle property taxes. Each request was wrapped in parental concern. "It's just easier if I take care of it," he'd say. "You work so much. Let me help." I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I nodded, smiled, and quietly began creating distance. It's amazing how invisible you can become in your own home once you stop giving people the reactions they want. They thought they were managing me, I was watching them. The first time I truly saw how deep the manipulation went was at a family dinner. My brother, Saad, had come over, and he was bragging about a new investment he was planning. He said, "Abba told me we might have some funds coming from the house soon, maybe a refinancing or something." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "What funds?" I asked. Saad blinked. "Didn't he tell you? He said you were helping us by putting the house up as collateral for a small business loan." I looked at my father. He didn't even flinch. He just said calmly, "Leena, don't make a scene in front of your brother. It's just paperwork. We'll handle it." Paperwork. That word tasted like poison. After dinner, when they'd all gone to bed, I sat in the dark living room, my living room, and let every lie replay in my head. My father had been using my name, my property, my signature, to dig himself and my brother out of debt. And my mother? She was the silent accomplice, smoothing things over, keeping me emotionally guilty enough not to question anything. I wish I could say I left that night, but I didn't. Because despite everything, some part of me still loved them. And love, real love, makes fools out of even the strongest people. Instead, I began to plan. Not revenge, not yet, but protection. I met with a lawyer of my own, someone I trusted from a past project. Her name was Samra, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with eyes that saw right through excuses. I told her everything. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "Leena, they can't legally transfer the deed without your consent. But if they've already forged documents, that's criminal." My throat tightened. "I don't want to send my parents to jail." She nodded slowly. "Then you need to make it impossible for them to touch anything again." Quietly. And so I did. Over the next few weeks, I changed account passwords, redirected mail, updated bank details, and placed a confidential freeze on the property record. I even transferred a portion of my savings into a new account under a trust name. All quietly. All legally. Meanwhile, I kept up the act, the obedient daughter, the naive girl who didn't know about lawyers or legal freezes. I smiled at my mother's questions about my finances, pretended not to notice when my father made business calls in the garden. But the silence between us had changed. It was thicker now, like the air before a storm. One morning, my mother came into my room holding a cup of tea. "Leena, we've been thinking," she began, setting it down gently. "Maybe it's time you moved out. You're always busy with work, and we'd like to have a bit more peace and quiet." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "You want me to move out? Of my own house?" She looked at me sadly, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "It's not about ownership, Beta. It's about respect. You're always tense these days, always suspicious. We can't live like this." I stared at her. The audacity of it, the calm, practiced manipulation, almost made me laugh. They were trying to push me out before I pushed back. That's when something inside me shifted from hurt to clarity. I realized my revenge didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be cruel. It just needed to be undeniable. I decided to give them exactly what they thought they wanted: space. I told them I'd move out temporarily for work. My father nodded approvingly. My mother hugged me with that false warmth she used when she thought she'd won. They didn't ask where I was going. They didn't care. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't leaving my house. They were. Before I left, I arranged for my lawyer to deliver official notices to the property, documents confirming the freeze, the ownership verification, and a polite reminder that any unauthorized occupants could face legal eviction. I also installed new security systems, quiet ones, with silent alerts directly to my phone. Cameras in the living room, back gate, and front entrance. Then I waited. For 2 weeks, I stayed in a small rented studio downtown, pretending to be busy with a new project. Every morning, I'd check the camera feed. My parents looked unsettled. They'd received the legal notice, but hadn't mentioned it to me. My father made phone calls that grew shorter and angrier. My mother spent hours pacing the garden. Finally, one afternoon, I got the alert I'd been waiting for: movement near the main gate, followed by a delivery van. My father was meeting with someone, handing over papers. My lawyer later confirmed it was a property agent. They'd tried to test the market value. That was the final straw. I returned the next morning unannounced. My mother opened the door, startled. My father sat in the living room, newspaper trembling slightly in his hands. "Leena," he said, forcing a smile. "You should have called before coming." I looked around the house, my walls, my floors, my life, and said quietly, "I think it's time you both packed your things." He blinked. "Excuse me? This house is legally mine," I said evenly. "You received the documents. You tried to sell what you don't own. I've given you 30 days to vacate. Starting today." My mother gasped. "You're throwing your parents out? What kind of daughter?" "The kind of daughter," I interrupted, "who's done being used." The silence that followed was the heaviest I'd ever felt. My father's face turned pale, his pride collapsing under the weight of something he'd never imagined: losing control. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just turned, walked to my room, and closed the door. That night, I lay in bed listening to the faint sound of my parents arguing in the next room. It wasn't anger that filled me anymore. It was peace. For the first time, I didn't feel like a child fighting for their approval. I felt like a woman reclaiming what was hers. And I knew this was only the beginning. If you've never seen your parents cry because of you, you might think it would make you feel powerful, like you finally have control after years of being small. But that's not how it feels. It's messy, confusing, and it breaks something inside you even as it sets you free. The morning after I told my parents to leave, I found my mother sitting on the porch, clutching her prayer beads.
She didn't look at me when she spoke.
"You think this makes you strong, Leena? Kicking your parents out like we're strangers?" I wanted to tell her that I wasn't kicking them out. I was reclaiming my space. But the words stuck in my throat. Because no matter how right you are, hurting your parents never feels righteous. It feels like sin. My father didn't speak to me for 3 days. When he finally did, his voice was cold. "You'll regret this.
People will talk.
They already are." And he was right. Word spreads fast in small neighborhoods. Within a week, I could feel the judgment like humidity in the air. Aunties at the local store whispered when I walked by. Old friends texted awkwardly asking, "Is everything okay at home?" One even said, "I heard your father said you turned greedy." That word, greedy, hit me like a punch. After years of giving, sacrificing, paying their bills, covering their debts, now I was greedy because I wanted the house I built to stay mine. Still, I didn't waver. I gave them time, more than I needed to. 30 days became 45. Every morning, I'd pass my father in the hallway, his silence loud enough to fill the room. My mother stopped cooking for me. She started leaving plates for two, just her and him, as if to remind me I wasn't part of the family anymore. The air in the house grew heavy, thick with unspoken words and emotional blackmail. One night, I came home late from work and found my father sitting alone in the dark living room. The lights from the street fell across his face, making him look older than I'd ever seen him. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "when you were 10 and you broke that window with your cricket bat? You cried all night until I said it was okay. I didn't even scold you." I nodded slowly, unsure where he was going. He looked up at me then, eyes glinting with something like bitterness. "You've changed, Leena. You used to feel guilt. You used to have heart." I wanted to scream that I still had heart, that my heart was exactly what they'd been stepping on all these years. But instead, I just whispered, "Yes, Abba, I've changed. You made sure of it." He turned away. After that, they stopped pretending. The warmth, the smiles, all gone. The house became a battlefield fought in silence. Then came the day they played their most dangerous card, the family. It started with a call from my aunt, my father's sister, a woman who'd barely spoken to me in years. "Leena Beta," she began sweetly, "I just heard such horrible things. How could you treat your parents like this? They gave you life." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. "Auntie, you don't know the full story."
"I don't need to," she snapped.
"Your father raised you alone when times were hard. And now you humiliate him by taking away his roof? Shameful. What kind of daughter are you?" I hung up before she could finish. But the damage was done. The calls kept coming, cousins, distant relatives, even a few of my parents' old colleagues. Some tried to reason with me, others just judged. Every word chipped away at my resolve, until I began to question myself. Was I cruel? Ungrateful? That night, I cried harder than I had since I was 23. Not because I doubted what I'd done, but because I realized how deeply family could weaponize guilt. In the days that followed, my mother stopped speaking to me entirely. She moved most of her things into the guest room, as if preparing for exile. My father avoided eye contact. I told myself I could handle it, that this Cold War was necessary. But it wore me down. Every quiet dinner, every slammed door, every sigh felt like another little fracture. The only person I could talk to was Samra, my lawyer. She'd become more than legal counsel. She was my anchor. "You're not a villain," she said one evening over coffee. "You're just the first person in your family to stop playing martyr. They don't know how to handle that." Her words gave me courage. 2 weeks later, I took a small but crucial step. I changed the locks. When the locksmith arrived, I told him to replace every bolt and deadlock on the main doors. My father watched from the garden, silent, but I could feel his fury radiating. When the locksmith left, my father finally spoke. "So, this is how it ends? You lock your parents out." I turned to him. "No, Abba. You locked me out a long time ago, the day you tried to steal what I built." For a second, something flickered in his eyes, shame, maybe. But then he said, "If your mother leaves this house in tears, it'll be on your head." And then he walked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the wind rattling the windows, wondering if I'd gone too far, if I'd become the monster they said I was. But then I remembered every time they'd laughed at my dreams, every lie they'd told, every time they'd made me feel like an ungrateful burden for wanting more. No, I wasn't a monster. I was just done being their victim. The next morning, I woke up early and found the house empty. Their clothes, their photos, even my mother's favorite teapot. All gone. On the dining table was a folded note in my father's handwriting. "We're leaving. Don't worry, we won't bother you again. May God forgive you for what you've done."
I stared at it for a long time.
The relief I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt hollow, like the house had exhaled and left me behind. For the first time since I'd built it, the house was truly quiet. No sounds of footsteps, no distant coughs, no clinking of bangles from the kitchen. Just stillness. At first, it felt peaceful. But soon, the silence became unbearable. Every creak in the walls sounded like judgment. Every room felt too big, too empty. I started working late, just to avoid coming home. I filled the space with noise, music, television, anything to drown out the guilt that kept creeping back. Weeks passed like that, until one evening, I came home and found an envelope slipped under the door. It was for my brother, Saad. Inside was a letter, handwritten and messy. Leena, I don't know everything that happened between you and them, but Abba is in bad shape. He's not talking to anyone. Amy cries all the time. They're staying with Annie now, but it's not good.
Please talk to them.
Saad. I sat there holding that letter, torn between anger and pity. The old Leena, the one who used to fix everything, would have rushed over immediately. But the new Leena hesitated. For days, I didn't respond. But the guilt festered. Finally, I called. My mother answered. Her voice was tired, distant. Yes, it's me, I said softly. A pause. Then, what do you want? I swallowed hard. I just wanted to check if you're okay.
We're fine, she said.
At least we have peace now. That word again, peace, used like a knife. Before I could reply, she added, You'll understand one day, when you have children. When they throw you out, maybe then you'll feel what we felt. The line went dead. I sat there, phone in hand, staring at the wall. The tears came slowly this time, not from sadness, but from clarity. I realized they weren't going to change. They weren't going to apologize. They'd rewrite the story in their favor, make me the villain in every version they told. And maybe that was okay, because I didn't need their forgiveness anymore. I needed closure. The next morning, I visited the property office and officially transferred the title of the house into a private trust, in my name only, with strict clauses. No loans, no transfers, no co-ownership. It would remain mine, permanently. It was the final act of protection, and of letting go. After signing the papers, I stood outside the office, sunlight warm on my face, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, freedom. But freedom, I learned, doesn't come clean. It comes wrapped in loneliness, in grief for what could have been. That night, as I sat on my terrace watching the city lights, I whispered to myself, You did it, Leena. You finally built a life they can't take from you. And for the first time, I believed it. But what I didn't know then, what none of us could have known, was that the story wasn't over. My parents weren't done. And the next time they came back into my life, they wouldn't come asking. They'd come taking. It's strange how peace never lasts when it's built on unfinished goodbyes. For almost 6 months after my parents left, life settled into something quiet, almost normal. I worked, I read, I traveled for projects. The house no longer felt haunted by their absence. It felt like mine again. Until one Tuesday morning, when a knock at the door changed everything. I opened it to find a courier standing there, holding a thick envelope with official seals. I signed for it absent-mindedly, assuming it was work-related. But when I tore it open, my heart dropped. It was a legal notice. A petition filed by my parents, claiming partial ownership of my house, citing financial contributions made during construction. They were suing me. For a few seconds, the world blurred. The papers trembled in my hands. I sank into the nearest chair and stared at the bold letters of my own name next to theirs. It didn't make sense. I'd built this house with my savings, my drawings, my sweat. They hadn't given me a single rupee. But here it was in black and white. An accusation, a demand, a declaration of war. My first instinct was disbelief. Then anger. Then something colder, resolve. I called Samra immediately. When she arrived that afternoon, she looked through the documents silently. Then she said, They've built their case on emotional language, not evidence. It won't hold up legally, but they're counting on you to break down emotionally before it reaches court. I laughed bitterly. So this is their final act of parenting, teaching me how to fight? She smiled softly. Maybe it's time you stop fighting for their love and start fighting for your peace. But peace doesn't come easily when betrayal wears the face of family. Over the next few weeks, the case began to crawl through the legal system. My parents didn't contact me directly, but I saw their names on every document, their signatures beside accusations that painted me as an ungrateful daughter who'd exploited her aging parents. They even claimed they'd provided funds from my father's retirement savings, a complete fabrication. I didn't know whether to scream or cry. Then one evening, Saad showed up unannounced. He looked nervous, holding his phone like a shield. "Leena, please don't be angry," he said, standing in the doorway. They didn't want it to get this far. Abba's friends convinced him to file. They said you'd settle quickly. Settle what? I snapped. Settle for them stealing from me again? He sighed. They just want to feel secure. You know how Abba is, proud, stubborn. Maybe give them something? Half the house, maybe? It'll end this. I stared at him, stunned. Do you hear yourself, Saad? They want to take away the one thing I built from nothing, and you're telling me to reward them for it. He looked away, guilt flickering across his face. You've always had everything, Leena. Maybe this is your turn to give back. That sentence, "you've always had everything," echoed in my mind long after he left. It was almost laughable. Everything I had, I'd built myself. Every dream they'd called impossible. Every night I'd cried in silence. Every rupee I'd earned. All of it had come from me. And yet somehow, I was the selfish one. That night I made a decision. I wasn't going to play the role they'd written for me, the emotional daughter who breaks under guilt. This time, I'd be the architect not of buildings, but of my own justice. So, I began planning. Not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. First, I dug through my old files, salary slips, tax returns, invoices from when I built the house, receipts from suppliers and contractors. I created a detailed timeline of every expense, every transaction. I wanted proof so airtight it could choke any lie. Then, with Samra's help, I drafted a counterclaim, not out of spite, but precision. It detailed their false statements, the forged declarations, and the damage to my reputation. But I didn't stop there. I knew my parents didn't want a legal battle. What they wanted was sympathy, the court of public opinion. They'd already started whispering to relatives and neighbors, spinning a story where I'd abandoned them and now was throwing them out of their rightful home. So I decided to show the truth. Quietly, carefully, I reached out to people from our old community, the ones who'd known me since childhood. I never badmouthed my parents. I didn't have to. I simply told them my story, the real one. How I'd built the house myself, how I'd supported my father's medical bills, how I'd let them live with me for free. I showed them receipts, messages, photos. I didn't argue.
I just presented facts.
It's incredible how truth can cut through even the thickest lies when you present it calmly. Within weeks, the same people who'd once whispered behind my back started to see me differently. One of them, an old family friend named Uncle Tariq, even confronted my father. She built that house with her own hands, Rashid. Don't destroy your own name chasing pride. Word reached me soon after. My parents were furious. The lawsuit continued, but their support began to crumble. For the first time in months, I felt something like control returning. Still, part of me ached. Because even in victory, there's sorrow when the enemy wears your mother's smile. The court hearings began quietly. My parents didn't make eye contact with me. My father's health seemed to have declined, his shoulders stooped, his face pale. My mother clung to him like a martyr, tears ready, for anyone watching. Their lawyer spoke dramatically about filial duty, about how I'd built the house using family resources. When it was my turn, Samra handed me the folder of evidence and whispered, "Stay calm. Just tell your truth."
So I did.
I told the court about my years of study, my work, the savings, the hospital bills I'd paid. I showed every bank transfer, every invoice. I spoke without bitterness, just clarity. And when I finished, the judge simply nodded and said, "The documents speak for themselves." I didn't cry in that courtroom, even though part of me wanted to collapse. I stood tall because I knew this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my story. The final verdict came a month later. The property and all legal rights remained solely mine. The petition was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't file again. I remember sitting there in stunned silence, hearing the words echo. It was over. The war I never wanted had ended. But the strangest thing happened when I looked at my parents that day. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindication. I felt tired. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother's lips trembled, but no tears came. For the first time, They looked small. Not monstrous, not powerful, just two people crushed under the weight of their own pride. As they turned to leave, my father paused. For a fleeting second, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he said softly, "You've won, Leena. But don't forget who gave you life." And then he walked away. That night, I went home alone and stood in the living room, staring at the walls that had once held so much laughter. The silence felt different now, not empty, but earned. I poured myself a glass of water, sat on the floor, and whispered, "I didn't win, Abba. I survived." But the story didn't quite end there. A few weeks later, a message popped up on my phone from an unknown number. It was my mother. "We've left the city. Your father's health is bad. Don't worry about us. I hope one day you'll forgive yourself." Forgive myself. The irony stung. But instead of replying, I closed the message and set the phone down. I didn't block her.
I didn't respond.
I just let it be. Because forgiveness isn't something you give to the people who hurt you. It's something you give to yourself when you stop needing their apology. In the weeks that followed, I renovated the house. Not out of vanity, but to reclaim it emotionally. I repainted the walls, replaced the old curtains my mother had chosen, opened up new skylights to let in more sun. Every brushstroke felt like erasing an old scar. When it was done, I hosted a small dinner for my colleagues, the first real laughter that house had heard in years. Someone complimented the architecture, saying, You can feel the peace in every corner." And I smiled, because they were right. For the first time, the house wasn't a battleground or a symbol of defiance. It was a home, mine, fully and finally. Sometimes late at night, I still think about my parents. I wonder where they are, if they're okay, if they ever think of me. And maybe one day, when the hurt isn't so raw, I'll reach out. But not today. Because today, I'm finally free from their expectations, from their guilt, from their need to control my worth. The same house they once said I couldn't afford now stands as proof that I could. And every time I walk through its doors, I whisper the words they never believed in. I am enough. The strange thing about peace is that it doesn't arrive all at once. It sneaks in quietly, through the smallest cracks, like sunlight through blinds you forgot to close. In the weeks after the court case, I thought I'd feel triumphant. I expected celebration, maybe relief that would wash over me and carry away the years of hurt. But instead, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. Emptiness. It was as if all the noise, the anger, the fear, the legal drama had stopped, and now I could finally hear myself breathe. And that sound was lonely. Every morning I'd wake up, make coffee, and stand in the kitchen that once echoed with my mother's chatter. I'd look at the chair my father used to sit on and feel this ache. Not regret, but the ghost of what could have been if things had been different. The house was beautiful. Clean, bright, calm. But there was a silence in it that felt like mourning. One evening, I sat by the living room window, watching rain fall against the glass. The garden lights shimmered softly, reflecting off wet leaves. I thought about calling my mother. I even picked up the phone once, typed out a message, "How's Abba? Are you both okay?" And then erased it. Because I didn't know if reaching out would heal me or reopen a wound I'd only just managed to close. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the years I'd spent trying to earn their pride. Every award, every promotion, every late-night design I'd stayed up perfecting, all of it had been a silent plea. See me. Believe in me. And now, without that chase, who was I? The next morning, I went for a long walk, something I hadn't done in months. The streets were still wet, the air crisp. I walked without direction, letting my thoughts drift. Eventually, I found myself outside an old art studio I used to visit during university. It was still there, tucked between a bakery and a bookstore. The door was open. I don't know what made me walk inside. Maybe curiosity, maybe nostalgia. But as soon as I smelled the faint scent of oil, paint, and turpentine, something inside me eased. A woman about my age was sitting by the window, sketching. She looked up and smiled. "You here for the open session?" I blinked. "Open session?" She nodded. "Every Saturday. No rules, no judgment. Just create." For a second, I almost said no. I hadn't painted in years. Architecture had replaced art. Precision had replaced passion. But then I thought, why not? So I stayed. She handed me a small canvas, some brushes, and a tray of colors. My hands trembled as I dipped the brush in red paint. The first stroke felt strange, almost foreign, like using muscles I hadn't moved in years. But then something clicked. Hours passed unnoticed. I painted without thinking, just feelings spilling out in color and shape. When I finally stepped back, I saw it. A house, standing tall against a storm, its windows glowing warm and alive. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were off, the lines uneven. But it was mine. For the first time in months, I felt something loosen in my chest, a quiet release, a kind of peace that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. After that, I started going back, every week. The studio became my sanctuary, a place where no one asked about court cases or family drama or forgiveness. They just asked, "What are you painting today?" And slowly, color began returning to my life. At work, too, things shifted. I found myself taking on projects that felt meaningful, not just profitable, community spaces, women-led startups, schools in underdeveloped areas. Every design carried a piece of me, a reflection of the woman who'd once been told she couldn't afford her dreams. One afternoon, my manager called me into his office. He smiled and said, "Leena, we've been talking about opening a new branch in Karachi and we want you to lead it." For a moment, I just stared at him. Me, the girl who once had to beg her parents to let her study architecture, now being offered leadership. I accepted, of course. But that night, when I returned home, I sat on the floor with my sketchbook and whispered, "See, Abba, I made it." Not in defiance, in gratitude to myself. Still, healing isn't linear. There were nights when I'd find myself crying without knowing why. Grief, I realized, doesn't always mourn the people we lose. Sometimes it mourns the version of us that tried so hard to be loved by them. One weekend, while sorting through some old boxes, I found a folder labeled University Applications. Inside were my original architecture sketches, the ones I'd shown my parents when I first told them I wanted to study design. I remembered that night so clearly, my mother shaking her head saying, "This is expensive, Leena. We can't afford your dreams." And now here I was, holding those same sketches inside the house I'd built, the one they said I couldn't afford. I laughed through tears. "You are wrong," I whispered. "I could." And I did. A few months later, as the Karachi branch project gained pace, my life began to fill up again. Meetings, deadlines, new people, new ideas. That's when I met Adil, one of the contractors. He wasn't the loud, confident type. He was quiet, observant, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. We started as colleagues, then friends. He had this calm way of asking, "You okay?" that made me feel seen, not studied. One evening, after a long site visit, we sat in his truck watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. He said softly, "You talk about your work like it's alive. But when you talk about your family, you go quiet." I didn't know what to say. So I told him everything, the betrayal, the lawsuit, the silence that followed. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he just nodded and said, "Maybe they broke the bridge because they couldn't stand to see how far you'd crossed it." That sentence stayed with me. Because it wasn't angry or pitying, it was understanding. Over the next few months, Adil and I grew closer. Not in the whirlwind kind of way, more like roots growing underground, steady and sure. He never tried to fix me. He just made space for me to exist, flaws, fears, and all. Through him, I began to understand something I'd missed all along. Not everyone who loves you will hurt you, and not everyone who hurts you deserves your hatred. Love, I realized, doesn't always come from where you expect. Sometimes, it finds you after you've stopped looking, when you're too busy building yourself back up to notice it's standing quietly beside you. And little by little, the emptiness inside began to fill, not with revenge or validation, but with peace. One rainy afternoon, I visited my father's old neighborhood to drop off blueprints for a project. I passed by our former house, the one we'd sold years ago. It looked smaller somehow. Older. A "for rent" sign hung on the gate. I stood there for a long time, remembering everything, the laughter, the arguments, the tears. Then I took a deep breath and whispered, "Thank you." Not because they'd hurt me, but because their disbelief had forced me to believe in myself. When I returned home that night, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea. The garden lights glowed softly, rain tapping against the leaves. I looked around at the home I'd built, and for the first time, I didn't think about who wasn't there. I just felt content. There's a kind of strength that comes only after you've lost everything you thought you needed to survive, the kind that whispers instead of roars, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself anymore. I'd spent years trying to earn love, then years trying to fight for respect. Now I'd finally found something better, peace that didn't depend on anyone else's permission. And maybe that's what healing really is, not erasing the pain, but learning to live beautifully around it. As I finished my tea, I glanced at the deed framed on the wall inside, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Every dream they said I couldn't afford, I built piece by piece, brick by brick, belief by belief. And maybe that's the real victory. Not the house, not the case, not even forgiveness. Just the quiet knowing that I did it, and I'm finally, truly free. Healing changes you in ways you don't notice at first. It doesn't happen in grand, cinematic moments. No dramatic music, no sudden clarity. It's quieter,
Softer.
for me, it began the day I stopped asking why my parents hurt me and started asking what now. That question became the foundation of everything that came next. After months of working on the Karachi project, my company officially promoted me to branch lead. It felt surreal, walking into an office filled with people looking to me for direction. Once, I'd been the girl too afraid to speak her dreams aloud. Now I was leading a team of 20, shaping designs that would define a skyline. But even as success surrounded me, something inside whispered that there was more to do, something beyond blueprints and buildings. That whisper turned into action one morning during a meeting with a young intern named Sana. She was bright, talented, full of raw ideas, and heartbreakingly unsure of herself. After the meeting, she lingered behind. "Can I ask you something, ma'am?" she said softly. "Of course," I replied. She hesitated, then blurted, "Did you ever have people tell you that you couldn't do this? That you were dreaming too big?" I smiled faintly. "Every single day." She looked up, surprised. "So, how did you keep going?" I thought about that for a moment, about every night I'd cried silently, every time my parents' voices echoed in my head, every step I took anyway. I stopped waiting for their permission, I said finally. And I learned that sometimes you have to believe in yourself loud enough to drown out their doubt. Sana's eyes glistened. "Thank you," she whispered. That moment stayed with me long after she left. Because I saw in her the girl I used to be, scared, hopeful, standing on the edge of her own future, waiting for someone to say it was okay to leap. And I realized, maybe that's what I was meant to do now. Not just build houses, but help others build themselves. So, a few months later, I started something small, a weekend workshop called Blueprints for Dreams. I invited architecture students, mostly women from modest backgrounds, who'd been told their goals were too ambitious. We met in my studio, surrounded by unfinished models and the smell of fresh paint. At first, only 3 girls showed up. They sat awkwardly, unsure what to expect. I began by telling them my story, not the polished version, but the raw one, the rejection, the fear, the moment my parents told me I couldn't afford my dreams. I didn't cry this time. I just spoke honestly. And when I finished, I said, "You don't have to prove anyone wrong. You just have to prove yourself right." That day, something shifted in the room. They started sharing about their parents, teachers, and communities that doubted them, about how small words of dismissal had shaped their confidence. We talked for hours. By the end, it didn't feel like a workshop. It felt like healing, collective, quiet, powerful. Over the next few weeks, more girls joined. They brought friends, cousins, classmates. My studio filled with laughter, ideas, and stories. And somewhere in that chaos, I found a new kind of peace, one that came from purpose. Every time I saw one of them present a design boldly, I felt something mend inside me. It was as if, by helping them believe in themselves, I was rewriting my own past. Adil supported me through it all, never demanding attention, just showing up. He'd bring snacks for the sessions, fix broken chairs, stay late helping clean up. One evening, as we stacked sketchbooks on the shelf, he said, "You realize what you're doing, right? You're becoming the person you needed when you were younger." I smiled quietly. Maybe that's how we heal, by becoming our own rescue. Life, for once, felt balanced. Until one afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Leena," a fragile voice said. My breath caught. I hadn't heard that voice in nearly a year. "Amy?" There was a long silence. Then she said softly, "Your father's in the hospital." For a moment, the world tilted. My first instinct was to hang up, to protect the fragile peace I'd fought so hard to build. But some part of me, the part that still remembered his laughter, his bedtime stories, couldn't. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "His heart," she whispered. "They say he'll recover, but he keeps asking for you." I closed my eyes. Old memories collided with new wounds. I didn't know if I was ready to see them again, if I could face the people who'd broken me and still hold my head high. But healing, I'd learned, isn't about erasing pain. It's about not letting it define your choices. So the next morning I went. The hospital room was quiet, the rhythmic beep of machines filling the air. My father looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, his once commanding voice now barely a whisper. My mother sat by his bed, her face lined with exhaustion. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Leena,"
I didn't know what to say.
so I just nodded and walked to the other side of the bed. My father's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion crossed his face. Then recognition. "Leena," he said weakly, his voice trembling. "You came." I wanted to be angry. I wanted to tell him he didn't deserve my presence. But instead, all I felt was sadness. "I came," I said simply. He tried to smile, but it looked more like regret. "You were right," he whispered. "About everything. I just didn't know how to accept that my daughter could stand taller than me." Those words hit deeper than any apology could have. Because in them, I heard not pride, but surrender. A man who'd spent a lifetime fighting his own insecurity.
I didn't forgive him that day.
But something inside me softened. We talked little, mostly small things. The weather, my work, his health. My mother listened quietly, her hands trembling as she poured water into a cup. When I stood to leave, she touched my arm. "Thank you for coming," she said. "He's been asking for you every day." I nodded. "Take care of him." As I walked out of that hospital, tears blurred my vision, not of pain but release. I realized I didn't need their apology anymore. I didn't need them to see my worth. I already knew it. And maybe that's the final stage of healing, when you stop needing closure from those who broke you, because you've already closed the wound yourself. A few weeks later, my father was discharged. I didn't see them again, but I heard through distant relatives that they'd moved back to our old city. I sent a small arrangement of flowers, no message, no name. Just color.
Just peace.
Meanwhile, blueprints for dreams kept growing. We received small sponsorships, and within a year, we had over 50 participants. Some of the girls had started winning competitions. One even got a scholarship abroad. Every success story felt like a seed I'd planted blooming somewhere out in the world. One evening, as I wrapped up a session, Sana handed me a small card. Inside, she'd written, "You taught us how to draw buildings, but more than that, you taught us how to build ourselves. Thank you for believing in us before we knew how." I held that card for a long time after she left. Because in those words, I found everything I'd once longed to hear. I walked to the window, watching the sunset spill golden light across my garden. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the girl whose parents doubted her. I felt like the woman who proved that even broken foundations can hold beautiful things. Life doesn't always give us the apologies we deserve, but sometimes it gives us something better. The chance to become whole on our own. And as I stood there, the soft evening breeze brushing against my face, I whispered, Maybe I couldn't afford my dreams back then.
But now?
My dreams pay for themselves. When the spring light finally returned, it poured through the big front windows of my house like forgiveness. It had been almost a year since the court had declared the house mine, but ownership had started to mean something far beyond a legal document. It was about reclaiming space, not just the physical walls that had once felt foreign, but the emotional room inside me I'd spent years shrinking to fit into someone else's approval. The neighborhood had changed colors too. The vines along the fences were blooming again, soft pinks and whites that reminded me of when Mom used to press petals into her Bible and tell me every flower had a meaning. Back then, I believed her. Now, I looked at them differently, not as messages from God, but as quiet reminders that beauty can grow back even after being stepped on. My mornings had a new rhythm. I'd wake early, open the curtains, and make myself coffee. Real, strong coffee. Not the instant packets I used to drink when I was too anxious about rent to buy groceries. I'd sit by the window with my notebook, working on freelance designs for small businesses that reminded me of where I came from, people trying to build something out of nothing. The same grit that had once been called foolish ambition was now my livelihood. I didn't hear from my parents much. The last time I saw them, Dad had come by with an envelope. Inside was a short note, barely 2 sentences long. "We're glad you're doing well. Hope you're happy." That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just a neutral kind of politeness that hurt more than anger ever could. For a long time, I wanted to hate them for that, for their ability to move on as if they hadn't torn my heart in two. But over time, I began to understand something unsettling. Their silence wasn't power, it was emptiness. They didn't have the emotional tools to say sorry because that would mean facing the kind of reflection they'd spent their lives avoiding. One afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Mom. Her voice was thinner, slower, the kind of tired that comes from regret more than age. "Leena," she said, her tone tentative, like she wasn't sure if she had the right to use my name. "Hi, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice steady. I wanted to tell you that your father's been sick. He's better now, but it scared us. We've been talking about everything." The silence after that word. Everything was heavy. It was the closest she'd ever come to saying we were wrong. "I'm glad he's better," I said softly. There was another pause. "We're selling the old house," she added. "It's too big now." "That makes sense," I said. She hesitated again. Would you come by? Just once before we go?" That question sat in my chest like a stone. I told her I'd think about it. For 3 days, I avoided making a decision. I went to work, cooked dinner, cleaned, watered my plants. All the things that made me feel in control. But the thought of that house, their house, wouldn't leave me alone. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about closure. When I finally drove over, I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance. The air smelled faintly of rain and cut grass, and for a moment, everything looked the same as when I was a kid, except smaller. The trees I once thought towered over the street now looked ordinary, their roots breaking through the cracked pavement. Mom was on the porch, wearing a cardigan I remembered from years ago. She smiled, the kind of smile that trembled at the corners. "You look good," she said. "Thanks," I replied. Inside, the house felt emptier than I expected. The walls were bare, boxes stacked in every corner. My old bedroom door was open. I hesitated before stepping inside. It looked different, yet hauntingly familiar. The faded lilac wallpaper I'd begged for at 13 was still there, peeling at the edges. My desk was gone, but the indent where the chair had scraped the floor remained. I traced my hand over the wall and whispered, "You saw everything, didn't you?" Mom stood in the doorway, watching me. "I didn't know you'd come," she said quietly. "I almost didn't." She nodded. "You were always strong. Stronger than I was." Her voice cracked on that last word. For the first time in my life, I saw her not as my mother, but as a woman, flawed, scared, and perhaps aware of all the small ways she'd failed me. "I wanted to protect you," she continued. "We thought if we pushed you toward something safe, you'd never have to struggle like we did." I looked at her. "But you never let me try, Mom." You made me believe I wasn't capable of my own dream. Tears welled up in her eyes. I know. For a moment, the years of anger between us seemed to thin. Not vanish, just loosen like knots starting to untangle. When I left, Dad was sitting in a chair near the window, his hair thinner, face softer. He didn't speak, but he met my eyes and nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that, in its own way, meant I see you now. As I drove away, I realized something important. Forgiveness doesn't always come wrapped in apologies or grand gestures. Sometimes it's just the absence of hate. The moment when you no longer want them to suffer, you just want peace. Back home, I unlocked the door to my house, the one they'd once said I could never afford. The deed with my name on it sat in a folder inside my desk drawer. I opened it, ran my fingers across the embossed letters, and smiled. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one crying in her childhood room after being told her dreams were too big. I wished I could tell her, they were wrong. You were always enough. That night, I stood in the backyard under the stars. The city hummed quietly in the distance, but here, there was peace. The same peace that had once felt impossible now lived in every brick of the home I'd built with my own two hands. I didn't win because I proved them wrong. I won because I stopped needing them to believe in me. I built a life out of the rubble they left behind, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. And maybe, just maybe, that's what real revenge looks like. Not making them regret losing me, but learning to live so fully that I no longer cared if they did.